There is one word that sums up the lessons being taught in all of the scripture readings that we have just heard. Just one word, and that word is overturn. Not just when Jesus overturns the tables of the money changers in the temple, but in every reading, the underlying concept is overturn. Let's begin with the first reading from the Hebrew scriptures taken from the book of Exodus. We hear God giving the law to Moses, and through Moses giving the law to God's people. In Hebrew, the word Decalogue means more accurately 10 words rather than 10 commandments. These 10 words are in fact the foundation of Israelite law, and they include the basic conditions for covenant membership. God has brought Israel out of bondage in Egypt into freedom. But it is a curious sort of freedom when compared to our contemporary notions of freedom. As people who love freedom and are proud of our national heritage, the 10 Commandments can feel like unfair encumbrances that limit our personal behavior. We get the feeling that at the center of each command is a negative finger waving, "Thou shalt not." For the Israelites, the opposite was true. These 10 words are words that will teach Israel how to walk with the Lord. The words that God gives are always a gracious gift, showing the way for God's people who have been brought out of slavery into their own land. These are guidelines for freedom, a way of living out our God-given freedom. Unlike our contemporary views that commandments are heavy, burdensome, back-breaking, spirit-stifling demands, the Bible sees them as God's gracious gift to us to show us the way. We tend to see laws and commands as limitations of our innate human freedom, but the Bible thinks of them as a pathway to true freedom. So a careful reading of this passage from Exodus gives us our first opportunity to overturn our misunderstanding of what the commandments are. God has not left us alone, wandering aimlessly on our own, but God graciously comes close to us and gives us specific guidance through the pathways of life, through the commandments. Our responsorial psalm with verses taken from Psalm 19 reinforces this understanding of the glories of the law. 6 synonyms are used to praise the law: law, decree, precepts, command, fear of the Lord, and ordinances. Each statement in this psalm identifies the law as belonging to the Lord. With this in mind, Scripture scholars suggest that the word for law, Torah, is better translated as instruction or teaching. In our brief second reading from the Christian scriptures, from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, Paul accomplishes several things in just a few short verses filled with contrasts and paradoxes. He dismantles the criteria that formerly divided two cultures and replaces it with a new religious standard. He redefines wisdom and folly, and he contrasts God's ways with human ways. Former members of both the Hebrew and Greek worlds made up the church at Corinth, and Paul tells them all that the way of Christ looks ridiculous when viewed from the standpoint of the ways of their former world. Paul criticizes the Jews for their demands for signs and the Greeks for their preference for philosophy. He says that the customary wisdom of these two cultures would reject a crucified Christ. This Christ, crucified, did not conform to the messianic expectations of Israel. A suffering Messiah was too much to accept, and his disgrace made him a laughingstock to the Greeks. A truly prudent man would not have acted as recklessly as Jesus did, ending in his execution. However, God frequently overturns our expectations. Paul argues that the vulnerable and debased Christ is in fact the power of God, and the ridiculous and despised Christ is the wisdom of God. However, it takes faith to see this. This brings us to our gospel passage and the ultimate overturning by Jesus. This story is found in all 4 Gospels, and yet the version told today by John is different in some important respects. A chief difference is chronology. Matthew, Mark, and Luke place this story towards the end of the gospel as Jesus triumphantly enters Jerusalem. Jesus' behavior in the temple provides the last straw as far as the authorities are concerned. They plot to have Jesus crucified precisely because of what he does in the temple. John locates this event much earlier in his gospel, and he makes the raising of Lazarus from the dead the more proximate cause of Jesus' death. In John's version, this passage that we've just heard comes in the 2nd chapter, immediately after Jesus changes water into wine at the wedding feast of Cana. Jesus travels to Jerusalem for the Passover, where he discovers the temple not filled with fasting and prayer, but with commercial activity. Driving out the merchants, Jesus denounces their practices, accusing them of turning this sacred space into a bank and shopping mall. In fact, the activities of the money changers and the merchants were legitimate. Foreign coins, denarii and drachma, bearing pagan images or imperial portraits, were not acceptable for paying the temple tax. So the money changers performed a necessary service by exchanging these foreign coins for acceptable ones. Animals, too, were needed for sacrifice. Pilgrims could not travel to Jerusalem with their animal in tow, so they had to buy one when they arrived. At first glance, it seems like Jesus' anger was aroused by the erosion of temple decorum, but in fact his actions were a prophetic proclamation that the end time was at hand. And identifying God as his Father affirms his right to make such a claim and to act in accord with it. The second historical question in this scene focuses precisely on his authority. They ask, "What sign can you give us for doing this?" And he answers, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The temple they were standing in began to be built by Herod the Great around 20 BC, and it was completed around 62 AD, shortly before it was destroyed by the Romans. Jesus overturns their expectations about where they would encounter God. They presumed that they and their descendants would journey to Jerusalem and find God in the temple. But John tells us that Jesus was talking about the temple of his body and about his death and resurrection. He is the new temple, the new place where humanity will make contact with God. Well, there it is. That is how every one of our scripture readings today can be summed up in just one word: overturn. Oh, but wait. There's one more thing that has to be overturned, and that is the word overturn. It must turn into turn over. Isn't that the business of Lent? Turning our hearts and our lives over to the Lord? Perhaps especially in those areas of our lives that are hermetically sealed to the Lord's presence. Like his presence in the temple, Lent is the time for cleansing the deep personal sanctuaries of our hearts and inviting the Lord to drive out of our lives whatever clutters up our discipleship and distracts us from answering his call to love and service.